I want to recap. So the main character of the story is, of course, Joseph. We remember that he is the 11th son of Jacob, whose other name happens to be Israel. And Joseph, of course, is a man who has prophetic dreams. And in one of his dreams, Joseph sees himself, I guess, standing among his family members, and all of the family members bow down to him. And I think this dream dominates the entire story arc of Joseph. And the dream is destined to be fulfilled. So yes, Joseph's brothers one day are going to all bow down to him. But more than that, Joseph will be the one to save his family from famine in the land of Canaan so that they can finally settle in the land of Egypt and grow and thrive there and become that great nation that God had promised to Abraham. Now, what I think is interesting is this. Joseph ultimately arrives at that final destination. He becomes this savior of his family only after a series of these random, disconnected, and more often than not, really unfortunate events, right? So it's, I think, by dumb luck that the Ishmaelite caravan just happens to be passing through Goshen just when the brothers are trying to figure out what to do with their brother, with Joseph. It's by chance that this caravan is destined for Egypt. It's by chance that he's bought by Potiphar. I suppose he could have been bought by anybody. It's by dumb misfortune that Mrs. Potiphar is attracted to him and seeks to seduce him and accuses him and ends him up and, puts him in jail ultimately. And so today, we'll look at another random series of events that brings Joseph just a couple of steps closer to his destiny. Okay, so remember what happened last week. We talked about Joseph. He was accused of assault by Potiphar's wife, and in the end, he's thrown in jail. So let's figure out what happens to him while he's in jail. Okay? So this is Genesis. I'm going to read Genesis 40, verses 1 to 4. Then it came about after these things that the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was furious with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So he put them in confinement in the house of the captain of the bodyguard in the prison, the same place where Joseph was imprisoned. And the captain of the bodyguard put Joseph in charge of them, and he took care of them, and they were in confinement for some time. So I remember what I said earlier. Joseph arrives at his destiny at the end of this whole story arc. He arrives at his destiny after this series of random, disconnected, and unfortunate events. And one random event is the imprisonment of Pharaoh's cupbearer and Pharaoh's chief baker. Now, spoiler alert, one of the two men will be instrumental in ultimately getting Joseph out of prison and, closer towards the fulfillment of his destiny. So the point is this. I think often what we do is we pit human free will against God's control over earthly events. And we view it almost like it were a zero-sum game. So if a human being exercises his or her free will, then God must give way. That's what we think, right? And likewise, when God exercises his sovereign will, then human beings are somehow robbed or deprived of their autonomy and freedom. We think it works that way, right? As a kind of a give and take, as a zero-sum game. But the story that we read today, like the whole story of Joseph, suggests that it's definitely not a zero-sum game. Because all throughout the Joseph story arc, human beings are acting freely. The brothers freely choose to sell Joseph into slavery. Mrs. Potiphar freely chooses to seduce Joseph. Potiphar freely chooses to throw Joseph in prison. Pharaoh freely chooses to throw his cupbearer and the chief baker into prison. And what happens is this. God is working through all of these apparently random events, these uncoordinated random events, being kind of led by human actors, God uses all of this to accomplish his great purpose, right? So it's not the kind of conflict between human free will and God's sovereignty that we think it is. Do you understand what I'm saying? So moving on, Genesis 40, verses 5 to 8. Then the cupbearer and the baker for the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, both had a dream the same night, each man with his own dream and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning and saw them, behold, they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were with him in confinement in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" And they said to him, "We have had a dream, and there's no one to interpret it." Then Joseph said to them, "Do interpretations not belong to God? Tell it to me, please." So in the story, of course, both the chief baker and the chief cupbearer have a dream. And the idea that dreams disclose, the notion that dreams disclose otherwise hidden truths, I think is a really important sub-theme, of course, throughout the story of Joseph. I think it's an important sub-theme throughout the Bible in general, right? Dreams are not just the random firing of neurons as we would tend to think of them today, but certainly in the ancient Near East, they were held to be of tremendous significance. But especially, I would say, they were significant biblically because the idea was that dreams revealed the will of God, right? So these men, they have these bizarre dreams and they're kind of sad and they're dejected. And the reason they're dejected isn't because they think that somehow these dreams spell doom for them. They're dejected, they're sad, at this point in the story at least, because they don't know the meaning of the dream and they don't have anyone to interpret that dream for them. That's the source of their sadness. In the ancient Near East, there were in fact people who believed themselves to be particularly skilled in dream interpretation. There were clearly such people in the court of Pharaoh. Later on, I think in the next few chapters, you'll remember, of course, Pharaoh has some bizarre dreams of his own, and we're told that, and I quote, "He sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of its wise men." So he's actually calling for these professional dream interpreters to help him out. When later on in the book of Daniel, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon has a frightening dream, he says, and I quote, "I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought here before me, in order that they might tell me the interpretation of the dream." There's a certain Old Testament scholar that I'm going to quote right now. Can't remember his first name, but Walton is his last name. And this is what he writes. In the ancient Near East, dream interpretations were sought from experts who had been trained in techniques and methods of the day. Both the Egyptians and the Babylonians compiled what are called dream books, which contain sample dreams along with a key to their interpretation. The dream books preserve the empirical data concerning past dreams and interpretations, and therefore offered the security of scientific documentation. So I think that's an interesting idea. Now, what the cupbearer and the chief baker don't know is that Joseph, who's their fellow prisoner, is actually a person who can interpret dreams. And when they find out that Joseph can interpret those dreams, they obviously want him to do just that. However, I want you to notice that Joseph doesn't say, "Look, I can interpret dreams." He phrases it differently. He says, "God can interpret dreams." He doesn't say, "I can interpret dreams." So in other words, Joseph doesn't use dream books. He doesn't use any established body of wisdom to interpret dreams. He does so, we're told, by the power of God. And I think that's important for understanding, again, the character of Joseph. As we've been discussing all along, Joseph is a man who is peculiarly gifted by God. God's hand is on Joseph in a way that God's hand is not on anybody else. So I'm going to go on, Genesis 40, 9 to 13. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph, saying to him, "In my dream, behold, there was a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. And as it was budding, its blossoms came out, and its clusters produced ripe grapes. Now Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you will put Pharaoh's cup into his hand, as in your former practice when you were his cupbearer. So the cupbearer has a dream that's directly related to his office, to his job. In his dream, as you recall, he sees this ripe grapevine with 3 branches growing from it, and each of these 3 branches blossom and grow into clusters of ripe grapes. The cupbearer then crushes the grapes and manages to fill the cup with, well, grape juice, but in the dream it's wine, because dreams are funny that way. And then he hands the cup over to Pharaoh. That's the dream. And Joseph interprets the dream as follows. The 3 branches represent 3 days, and when these 3 days have been squeezed out, as it were, the cupbearer will be handed over to Pharaoh and will continue to serve him just as he did before. So it's a favorable interpretation of the dream. And the cupbearer no longer has to worry, am I going to be in jail for an extended period of time? Am I going to be here for the rest of my life? Is Pharaoh going to kill me? No, he's got this sense, because of the dream that's been interpreted, that he's going to get out in roughly 3 days' time. So good news for him. But Joseph adds this after he gives this favorable dream interpretation. This is verses 14 to 15. He says, only keep me in mind when it goes well for you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon. So at any rate, Joseph urges the cupbearer to remember him when he's restored to Pharaoh's service. And then what he does, Joseph, is he tells the cupbearer his story. He says, look, I was kidnapped when I was in my own homeland, sold to an Egyptian slave master. And then even though I was innocent, I was falsely accused of a crime I didn't commit. And Joseph is hoping that when the cupbearer finds himself once again in Pharaoh's service, he'll explain Joseph's situation to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is then going to intervene and, God willing, set him free. Anyway, the chief baker hears all of this. Now he's excited because it was a good interpretation. Verses 16 to 19, it says, when the chief baker saw that he had interpreted favorably, he said to Joseph, I also saw in my dream, and behold, there were 3 baskets of white bread on my head. And in the top basket, there were some of all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh. And the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. Then Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 more days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and will hang you on a wooden post, and the birds will eat your flesh off you. So not a favorable interpretation there. As in the dream of the cupbearer, the 3 baskets represent 3 days. And at the end of those 3 days, the baker's head will be lifted up. However, the lifting up of his head will not involve him being restored to his former office, to his former job. It will involve instead his decapitation. And just as the birds in the dream were eating the bread from the baskets, so too will the birds literally eat his flesh in real life. I know it's disgusting, but that's the interpretation, right? This was apparently, this is gruesome, I'm sorry to say this, but apparently back in the day it was relatively common if you really wanted to execute someone in a horrible and gruesome way that dishonored the corpse, is there would be a decapitation, and then the body would be left to hang somewhere and exposed to the elements where the birds would get to them. Interestingly, notice that Joseph, like all biblical prophets, he has a word of both comfort and judgment. I find this to be true for the biblical prophets. There is a sharp edge to what they say. It's a double-edged sword. So yes, the biblical prophets will often come along and give a word of judgment to the people of Israel, but they'll also offer a word of hope as well. And we see that here today, a word of judgment and a word of hope. Jeremiah the prophet says, "See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. So Joseph, in that sense, is like a prophet in this story. What I find interesting, too, is that the dream that the cupbearer has and the dream that the baker has could easily have been interpreted differently, because dreams are like, people look at items in the dream and view them as symbols, but you can take those symbols to mean different things, various things, right? So Joseph, for example, could have said to the cupbearer, in 3 days, Pharaoh will crush you, just as you crush those grapes into the cup. Or he could have said to the baker, in 3 days, God will lift up your head and remove your shame, just as the baskets were lifted from your head. So with dreams and visions, there's a whole myriad of possible interpretations. The fact that Joseph gives the right interpretation, that is, the interpretation that actually comes true, may have little to do with his actual ability to interpret dreams and more with the supernatural guidance of God. That's the thing with Joseph. Again, he's a man who's supernaturally guided by God. He is a man upon God has placed his hand and said, this is my servant. My purpose going forward will be accomplished through him. Walter Brueggemann writes, he's an Old Testament scholar and theologian. So Walter Brueggemann writes, the dream is a gift, and its interpretation is a gift, done not by a special skill or technique, but by the power of God freely given to this particular man. All right, so Genesis 40, 20 to 23, the last few verses of that chapter. So it came about on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he held a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office, and he put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. God's sovereign will, as interpreted by Joseph, does in fact come to fruition. The cupbearer is lifted up to his former station, and the baker is lifted up on the gallows. However, the cupbearer forgets to say anything about Joseph to his master. So once again, it seems like Joseph is like driftwood. He's like flotsam on the waves, and he's being pushed this way and that way by the decisions of people who have no ultimate end in mind, right? Again, sold into slavery by his brothers, bought by Potiphar, seduced by Potiphar's wife, tossed into jail, and finally ignored by the cupbearer. But Joseph's story, and I think not to mention the whole story of God's people, the whole story of humanity for that matter, is being guided by the sovereign hand of God. Right? So I think that's a key idea in this story. The story does end on a dark note. The story ends, today anyway, with Joseph in jail, forgotten. And I think Joseph has the sense or the hope that things are going to turn out well for him because he probably remembers the dream of his brothers bowing down to him. And he knows that somehow, in some way, shape, and form, that dream is going to be fulfilled. But as he's sitting in jail, he's wondering, how is it going to be fulfilled? Is it ever going to be fulfilled? Is there any hope for me, or is that dream just an illusion? And I find myself struggling with that as a Christian a fair bit. And maybe you do too. We can talk about that a little bit. But I have hopes, ultimately, that all creation will bow down to Jesus. I have hopes that we will see him reign perfectly one day. I have hopes that the church and the mission of the church will be restored and that the church would be able to act and work in society in such a way that people glorify Jesus. But I don't see, sometimes I just feel that's not happening. And I wonder if the cupbearer is ever going to say anything to Pharaoh, if you know what I mean, right? I wonder if there, I know that there's hope, right? But sometimes it's just hard to hold on to the hope, is what I'm saying. As it's probably hard for Joseph to hold on to hope in prison. But things do turn out well for Joseph, and I have hopes that things will turn out well for us too.